Hi, welcome to the Prairie Oaks Pulpit Bible Study. And today we're looking at Moses, specifically some of the early years of Moses. If you want the background, Exodus 1 and 2, but we're going to be reading from Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11, going to begin in verse 23, and let's see what it says. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's command. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover, and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians, attempting to do so, were drowned. Now, we start at the bookends. So the first verse that we read, verse 23, it says, by faith Moses, but it isn't Moses' faith we're talking about. It's the faith of his parents. Bonus points if you remember their name, because it's only said like once or twice. But by faith, Moses, his parents protected him. They protected him when he was a baby. They saw that he was a beautiful child, as says here. Different places it describes it in different ways, but they could see there was something about him, because every parent thinks their baby is beautiful, or if they don't, we wonder what's wrong. But they knew something was special, and they wanted to preserve his life and did so by faith for 3 months, trying to hide a baby from infanticide going on around them. And you remember the story. She hid the baby in a little boat that she had made of bulrushes and covered with tar, and she put it out into the river with his older sister watching, and God miraculously provided, providentially provided, so that he was adopted by a member of Pharaoh's household, Pharaoh's daughter, and she paid Moses' mother to feed him for 3 months until he was old enough to be weaned. Because, what do you know? There was Moses' sister watching out and saying, hey, I know someone who can wet nurse him for you. Yes, very providential, if not miraculous in and of itself. And so then he was raised in Pharaoh's household. And then as we see in verse 24, Moses starts making decisions. But I wanted to point out that first verse, it's the faith of his parents, because they set the course. I don't know what all took place in that few years they had him, but they set the course so that, as Stephen would put it, it came into Moses' heart that he wanted to investigate his birth family, his birth nation, the ones who were of his blood and of his flesh. And that's what started this next set of decisions. And so it is the faith of the parents. Here we are on Father's Day. Fathers, are you communicating a faith in Jesus Christ to the next generation? Mothers, are you doing so? Because you're communicating something to the next generation of what your priorities are and what's important to you. I hope that Christ is important to you, and it's communicated to the next generation. Verse 24, by faith Moses, when he became of age, now it's his turn to make the decisions. And what is the decision he makes? He decides he refuses to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He rejects the family that adopted him. And in most cases, we'd be like, oh, that had to really hurt. But in this case, the family that had adopted him is treating cruelly his birth people, the Egyptians, to the Israelites, having made them slaves, suffering bondage. And oddly enough, instead of gloating over the people who he could have been one of those slaves in bondage, but instead he's in a place of privilege, he turns down the privilege in order to be choosing to identify with the children of Israel. What was he gaining in doing so? I'm glad you asked. That's where verses 25 and 26 come in. Verses 25 and 26, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. He chose to suffer persecution, affliction with the people of God. Because sin has its pleasure, but it's only passing. It's only temporary. We live in a world that is in it for the short-term gain, regardless the long-term pain. And we are challenged by God in Christ to choose the long-term gain in spite of the short-term pain, because that's the choice that Moses made. He was willing to suffer affliction to identify with the people God had chosen rather than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, because there is a cost, even in our country, to identify with Christ. All those who desire to live godly in this present age, Paul said, will suffer persecution. Verse 26, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. He reckoned, he accounted that the reproach, the reviling because of the name of Christ, was more valuable than all the treasures in Egypt. And you'll remember, they had a lot of gold in Egypt. They stuck it in tombs, they stuck it everywhere, except in people's pockets. He chose it was better to be mocked because of Christ, because of the Messiah. In his case, he was identifying with the people who would produce the eventual Messiah. We look back and say, we claim this Messiah as more valuable than whatever fame, whatever pleasures, whatever riches, whatever is offered, prestige in this world isn't worth it compared to claiming Christ. Why? Verse 26 puts the tag on it. For he looked to the reward. There was a better reward for following Christ than there was for following the world. I took some notes here. He chose pain and loss over pleasure and riches because he wanted to gain joy and the reward. Did you catch that? He chose pain and loss. He lost access to all the riches and privileges of being in Pharaoh's household. He chose pain, painful living, away from all the pleasures, away from the riches. But why? Because he was gaining long-term joy. Remember Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despised the shame. And what was the reward? And he is sat down at the right hand of God. He was following Christ's example. And for the people that this letter was written to, I want you to notice in Hebrews 10, verses 32 and following. Hebrews 10:32. The pastor of the Hebrews says, "But recall the former days in which, after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle, both by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated. So not only did they suffer, but they were willing to identify with those who were suffering loss, mockings, persecution, pain. You became companions of those who were so treated." Verse 34, "For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods." The writer says he was in chains, and you still identified with me. And even accepted the joy, the loss of your own goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. They saw the trade. Oh, this stuff down here, where moth and rust corrupts and where thieves break in and steal, we're going to lose it anyways. Let's lay up for ourselves treasures in heaven, eternal, where they cannot be stolen, where they cannot rot, and where they cannot be rusted. No robbery, no rusting, no rotting. Eternal, glorious reward. He looked for the reward. And so these middle verses here, verses 24 through 26, we see where the emphasis is on the choosing. He chose. He did the math. He counted the cost, and he said, "I gain following Christ." Are we counting the cost like Christ told us? Weighing our options and seeing that Christ is gain. Whatever it cost us, it's minuscule compared to what we gain in Christ. And then verse 27, "By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible." And it coincides with his parents, right? His parents didn't fear the king, did they? They didn't fear the government. They did what was right. And here the emphasis is on Moses making the same choice. He didn't fear the government. He didn't fear the king. He endured. He did what was right. He abandoned Egypt. And it was a choice that was not once, but it was throughout his life. Because if you look in your study notes, you might notice that a lot of them quibble over, well, what occasion is this referring to? Because when he first left Egypt, he was afraid of the king, wasn't he? He may have left to save his life, but he also knew that it wasn't God's time to rescue the children of Israel. They weren't ready yet. Were they ever ready? Apparently, God got them rescued. But at that point, they weren't ready for a judge and a deliverer, were they? Who made you that? We don't want that. That's Stephen's big point in Acts chapter 7 when he preaches this section. But Moses abandoned Egypt. Everything, those privileges, all the riches, whatever it was, he abandoned it to be a nomad in the desert and wait for God. Because the implication in Exodus and in Acts and here is that he understood he was supposed to be the deliverer of the children of Israel. But it wasn't then. He didn't understand. And so he goes to be a shepherd in the wilderness. And when he came back to Egypt at God's direction to be the deliverer, we see throughout his interchange with Pharaoh, throughout that, with his brother Aaron at his side, he was not afraid of Pharaoh. He was a man who had seen God at the burning bush, the invisible God. And so he endured whatever they threw at him, whatever insults, whatever threats. He endured by faith, keeping the Passover, by faith, following God's directions. Remember how we talked about that with Noah? He followed God's directions, the slow, methodical direction of God. Keeping the Passover, sprinkling the blood, and rescued the firstborn of Israel from the final plague against Egypt. And so we see a choosing pain in order to gain. And then we see there was a fearlessness in this. And then lastly, at our bookends, we also see verses 23 and verse 29, a passing. In 23, it was his parents' faith, right? Well, in 29, now it's the whole nation. Because you'll notice it wasn't by faith it was by faith they. Moses' faith had transferred to the nation. There would be a lot of failures if you've read Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But that day, by faith, they, the children of Israel, passed through the Red Sea on dry land. The Egyptians did not have faith in the living God and were drowned in the same Red Sea. The same God, the same waters. The only difference is one people trusted God and the other people defied God. I pray that we don't make that kind of mistake, but that we trust God, looking to the reward, just as Moses chose. We look to the reward. And so this is the walk of faith. As we're coming up on the end of our three messages here, we saw where Noah, he trusted God and followed his instructions. He was forewarned and followed the instructions, building an ark, seeking after God. And then we see Abraham and Sarah. They trusted God and waited, even in spite of their doubts and fears. They trusted because they were waiting for better. They were looking for a reward. And now we see where Moses completes this series by saying he too chose. He waited by faith because he saw the reward. There is a reward laid up for us who follow Christ, joint heirs with Christ, in a kingdom where he is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Let us trust in him. Let us receive the gift of forgiveness. And let us walk boldly in this world, sharing that. Because in both the time of Noah and the time of Moses, there's a generation that is lost and does not know the true God. And how will they know unless someone tells them? Thanks for joining me. God bless you. God keep you. I look forward to next week.